get started. I wanted to introduce Scott Crawford. He will share his reflections tonight on Gilbert Stuart's iconic Lansdowne portrait. With a master's degree in colonial American history, he is an engaging speaker. We've had him before, so I know that's the truth. With a passion for history and art and teaching. His diverse career includes having served as an adjunct instructor at Virginia Tech, at Radford University, and Virginia Western Community College, as well as being the Director of Education at the Tallman Museum of Art. He is currently the President and CEO of Virginia Utility Protection Service, and we know that as Virginia 811, the Miss Utility. So, Scott, it's all yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me here tonight at my home, so I can come in and give a talk on this painting that I've been involved with for several years now. I really appreciate everybody joining, though, especially supporting the Salem Museum, and just hearing that list of upcoming events sounds really exciting, and especially that Military Living History Day that I had not known about that one. So I'm looking forward to checking that out. But definitely some great things going on, and I'm honored to be here tonight to help the Salem Museum and provide some insight into the Lansdowne portrait by Gilbert Stuart. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can see some of these images here. And there we go. And I hope that's working. Everybody, is that good? Everybody see the painting? All good? Okay.
All good.
Okay, fantastic. You never know with technology. So, all right. So again, this is the painting we'll be talking about tonight. The title of this presentation, though, is An American Noah, the Rule of Law and the Great Deluge in Gilbert Stuart's Lansdowne Portrait. I was asked, and some of you might have heard us talking, Fran and I, before this actually started. She was asking about what drew me to this painting and got my interest piqued about it. And I was saying that basically, it's really hard for me to tell a lot of times what it is about a particular painting that gets me really engaged with it. And some of these relationships, and I do say relationships, I feel that when we engage the arts, whether it be poetry, literature, the fine arts, and so forth, that it is something that's worth developing a relationship with. Just like with a human being, you want to look at the details of the person, who their personalities, their senses of humor, and all of that. And similarly with the humanities, what we engage, we develop a relationship looking at the details, the nuances, the context, and the relationship can change over time. This particular painting, if I'm not mistaken, I've been working with for almost 7 years off and on. And even just for this presentation, I got some additional insight on it. And that's what just excites me so much about history, about the arts, is how at different times in your life they can speak to you in different ways. And so in this particular case, though, what really sparked this, and I do want to take a moment to mention here that that this individual, Mike Pace, who many of you may know, he was a local lawyer, and sadly he just recently passed away. And he was an individual I had gotten to know several years ago. With his work, along with Tim Isaacs, who I used to teach with, they had begun a program at Roanoke College known as the Center for Teaching the Rule of Law. And both individuals very passionate about the rule of law and ensuring that this is something that was being addressed in the curriculum throughout Virginia and beyond, in regard to help students understand what the rule of law is, why it matters, why it's important. And so I was fortunate enough to be involved with them as a member of their education committee that they had formed to help, provide them with access to educators and talk about, curriculum development and so forth. And Mike, again, was heavily involved in this, and had the pleasure of getting to know him. And that's a picture of us, well, him, I was the one taking the picture, but in 2016, December of 2016, when we went up to a national conference of social studies to engage social studies teachers from across the nation and talk to them about the rule of law. And so it was really that work with them, with Tim and Mike, that when we were looking at potential talking points about George Washington, basically, I started trying to bring in some of the arts because that's what I like to do. And I was looking at different portraits, but now I'm looking at the portraits with a perspective of the rule of law. That was heavily on my mind because that's the topic we were covering. And in that context, I looked at a painting that I had seen, of course, many times, the Lansdowne portrait. There's 4 versions of this portrait that exist, 4 copies basically of the painting. One is in the National Portrait Gallery, one is in Pennsylvania Academy of Arts, if I'm not mistaken, one in the Brooklyn Museum, and of course, one is in the White House. So if you've ever had a tour of the White House, you might have seen it. And occasionally various presidents, when they're being televised and they're giving maybe a talk of some sort, sometimes you'll see it behind the president on the newscast, the address. And so the painting's, of course, one that is iconic. It's tied heavily to the American mind as far as our important portraits and such. But with this thought of the rule of law, as I looked at it, I started formulating some thoughts on it that that really excited me in regard to how Stuart may be attempting to portray Washington in a way that really does capture a lot of his beliefs, but also is saying something that was very important to the founding fathers, Washington in particular, about the rule of law. And so, as I was saying to Fran, a lot of times when you start like really spending some time with a painting, let's say, could be a poem, could be a work of literature, but in this case, a painting, and you start to develop that relationship and you start picking on these little details and start picking away at them to learn more about the details, it can just begin to, like a thread, begin to just bring about this unraveling of the cloth or such. And you just start getting more and more pulled into the particular work. And that journey, and it's truly a journey. You start, better understanding not only the work possibly, but understanding yourself about what is important to you and why did that catch my eye? Why am I drawn to that? Why is this interpretation what's formulating? And so, again, an incredibly rewarding experience. And that's definitely been the case with this painting. It was painted in 1796, again, by Gilbert Stuart. This is painted toward the end of Washington's 2nd term as president. And of course, that will be his last term as president because he will set a precedent that will hold true up until FDR. And then after FDR is now basically set somewhat in stone in the Constitution as a constitutional amendment that a president can only serve 2 consecutive terms. Washington chooses that 2 terms is enough. He knows that his position as president, the first president under the U.S. Constitution, is a term, 2 terms in this case, that are going to be heavily scrutinized, heavily observed. He is going to, with almost every decision he makes, impact that office and set precedents that will shape that office for generations. And so he chooses to only serve 2 terms in order to avoid a precedent of any type of, say, a cult of personality developing where a president could assume greater power than maybe he or she was intended to have. And so this decision on his part was an incredibly important decision for the presidency and for our own history. And he has made that decision at the time that he's sitting for the portrait. What brought him to the portrait to sit for Gilbert Stuart, or should I say stand, was Senator William Bingham, who was a Federalist in Congress, in the Senate. And Bingham was somewhat of a name dropper. He liked to associate with important people, and he had gotten to know the Lansdowne, the Marquis of Lansdowne in England, and he wanted to create for Lansdowne to make an opportunity to give him a really nice present. And he thought that a portrait of George Washington would be a fitting present. So in that spirit, Washington was not too excited about this. You can see, though, that it does end up obviously happening. And the portrait of Bingham there is also done by Gilbert Stuart a year later. And you can't help but notice that in all likelihood, Bingham was wanting to somehow compositionally be tied to the Lansdowne portrait. They have several elements there that are pretty strikingly similar. The stance, the red tablecloth with the table, similar chairs, the drapes, columns. You know, it's different, but yet it definitely has allusions to the Lansdowne portrait. But again, Washington was not as excited about necessarily getting his portrait done again. And many times we hear the saying that behind every great man is a woman. And quite often I would say behind every great work of art is a woman as well, because in this case, it was Bingham's wife, Anne Willing Bingham, who was purported to be one of the most beautiful women in America at the time. And she was very close to Washington and was the one primarily responsible for convincing him to pose for the portrait with Stuart. So due to her work and encouragement, we have this painting to talk about tonight. This is the gentleman for whom the painting was created, Marquis of Lansdowne, William Petty. He had been a fairly pro, and don't run too far with that description, but pro-American British politician during the Revolutionary period. He had worked with Pitt the Younger during the Stamp Act crisis to get the Stamp Act repealed. So he was showing sympathy toward the colonies in that crisis. He was also the Prime Minister of Britain when the first round of treaty negotiations began in 1783 to end the American Revolution and to give America its independence, for Britain to recognize America's independence. And while his tenure as Prime Minister did not carry through to the signing of the treaty, he was voted out prior to that. He was an instrumental force in helping bring about the opportunity for that treaty to be signed. And so in that context, he was seen as sort of a friend to America. And so Bingham, of course, was attracted to him for those reasons. And also Bingham was very much a proponent for free trade. So too was Lansdowne. He too was very much on the English side, an advocate for free trade. And keep in mind, during this period, revolutionary France had erupted. The French Revolution had been occurring. We're on the eve of Napoleon gaining power. Britain and France were on and off again at war with each other. A lot of that spilled over to the high seas, impressment of American ships, American sailors. And so there was a lot of concern about free trade and tariffs and all of that. And so this passion for free trade also brought Bingham and Lansdowne together. And so within that, again, larger picture, Bingham felt that a portrait of Washington would be a very fitting present for Lansdowne. And so that's what basically brought Washington to Gilbert Stuart's studio in 1796, in the spring of 1796. Washington, of course, with Stuart, had posed a couple of times. So this was not the first time that Washington had posed and sat for Gilbert Stuart. One of the other paintings done just a year earlier was the Vaughan portrait, which some of you may be familiar with. Yet another Gilbert Stuart of Washington. But of course, the one that we're all familiar with is the portrait that was never entirely finished, as you can tell. And we all know that because that is the image that was used for the dollar bill, Gilbert Stuart's portrait of Washington there. And when you look at these two portraits, though, and this is difficult depending on how big your monitor is that you're looking at, but you might lean forward and kind of look, and then I'll try to help you here and give you a detail of both. In the top left corner, you have the portrait of Washington from the Athenaeum portrait, and then the bottom right is the Lansdowne portrait. And you might be able to make out that there's something going on with Washington's jaw in the Lansdowne portrait that's not as evident in the Athenaeum portrait. In the Athenaeum portrait, his jaw's a little more relaxed and it's pulled back a little bit. It seems like it's jutting out slightly in the Lansdowne portrait. And his lips are a little tighter and so forth, the way he's depicted. And this was due to the unfortunate reality that George Washington was struggling with a new pair of dentures when he sat for the Stuart portrait, the Lansdowne portrait. These were new dentures. They were ill-fitting. They were incredibly uncomfortable. They popped out on him a couple of times, which was not, too good for his self-esteem, I'm sure. And so he was really uncomfortable while he was posing for Stuart for the Lansdowne portrait due to these dentures. Also with this, what is interesting is that Stuart only captured his head as far as for this painting because he had up to 3 other individuals actually stand for Washington, and he used their bodies for the models for the body. So that's not an incredibly accurate representation of Washington's physique because he had stand-ins come in and he painted their body part and only painted Washington's head when Washington was there. This also is with his hand that's outstretched, which is such an important part of this portrait, his outstretched hand. It's said and believed that Stuart actually used a wax image of his own hand to paint for the depiction of Washington's hand. And then similarly, if you look at this closely, you might suggest from a critical perspective that there's some proportions that are off with the body and head. And that's why, because he was putting a different body on and it just came out a little off, that some art historians and critics have noted. So a little, again, more about as far as the depiction of Washington. There's one other interesting point, and that's with his eyes, which Washington had very hazy, light blue eyes. And when it was first painted, the eyes were incredibly bright blue. And when asked about that, Gilbert Stuart said, because I've painted them in a way that 100 years from now, they will fade and be the correct color. So he's thinking ahead. He's thinking down the road, what this is going to look like and so forth. And so it's kind of an interesting story about his eyes as well. As far as the portrait itself, its composition, this is not necessarily in any way, shape, or form a unique composition in regard to depicting a head of state, such as Washington. This has a long history. We can span back just across the 18th century. Here's Louis XIV, painted in 1702, and you can see similar compositional elements that tie the portraits together. Again, the red sash across the top, columns, the pose, and so forth. Although Louis XIV and Washington, I think you could probably argue to have a slightly different projection that's occurring with their respective poses. One is a little more outreached and open. One is a little more authoritarian. Or that's just our bias because we know one's a king and one is not. One's a president of a republic. Here's another painting of another a religious figure, of course, from the period from 1704. Again, similar kind of compositional depiction of this is, again, to indicate this is how a person of power is reflected on canvas. And here's an engraving of that painting. And again, that one makes the similarities become a little clearer as his position is turned because it's an engraving. And then another one where now we have, again, a table with books on it and papers and a tablecloth and the columns off to the side similarly. And that one, if I'm not mistaken, that one is by Gilbert Stuart. So that's another Gilbert Stuart painting. And again, similar in regard to how the individuals are depicted. So you have this, at least here represented here, 100-year period of different examples of portraits of heads of state, judges, political figures, religious figures that are depicted in a similar way. Washington is a president of a new young country. This is artistically putting him in the league with those other heads of state by depicting him in a similar manner. However, it's not entirely similar, is it? He is not as regal. He is a little more, again, with an outstretched arm, depicted as almost as if he's giving his farewell address, as some art historians have suggested, because that was being created while this painting was being created. Washington was working with Madison and Hamilton to create his farewell address, which was never an address. He never gave it. It was published in a New York newspaper. So it was more of a farewell essay of sorts, but nonetheless, a lot of words of wisdom in that address that we still look at today, and you're going to be seeing in a few minutes. But nonetheless, it's as if he's delivering this oration. It's not as authoritarian. His hand is rested loosely on his sword. It's not a military sword. It's a dress sword, which is important too. He's dressed down. He's dressed in a plain black outfit, more as a man of the people. So it's an interesting aesthetic take and compositional perspective on sort of bringing together the power of the individual in previous portraits, but yet toning it down with certain Republican ideals. And I mean that with a small r, being a democratic republic that he was serving as president over at the time. He's a man of the people in a sense, to that degree. Oops, it didn't advance. There we go. And then, you need to understand, of course, Washington, he was incredibly popular, even though when this painting was painted, he had been going through a hard time with the Jay Treaty that had been signed. It was a tough fight in Congress. And earlier, just a few months earlier, it was leaked to the public. The public was not happy with the Jay Treaty. They felt it was a sellout to England. Washington was actually burned in effigy. It was really upsetting to Washington how the public turned against him. But the public is fickle. It can be forgiving. And Washington's image by this point, even with the Jay Treaty fiasco, it was still an image that was in almost every home in America. His image appeared on china, in engravings, just anywhere that you could find an image, his image would possibly appear in it. And so, as Joseph Ellis, the historian, has noted, he references one popular toast of the day, which would say that Washington was the man who unites all hearts. And as Ellis depicts him, he sees him as he truly was an American Zeus, Moses, and Cincinnatus, all rolled into one. And of course, Cincinnatus was even a society of the Cincinnatus that was formed by officers of the Revolution to celebrate that Roman dictator who rose to the challenge when the Roman Republic was threatened and was made dictator, all powerful over the Roman Republic. And in 16 days, when he achieved the military victories needed in only 16 days to put the threat at rest, Cincinnatus gave up his sword, gave up his power, and went back to his farm. And that was seen as just a perfect example of public virtue and doing what's best for the country, for the nation, or in that case, the Roman Republic. Washington was fashioned after Cincinnatus. For goodness sakes, he tried to give up his sword after the Revolution, and then he was pulled back into public service as president of the Constitutional Convention. And then, of course, he's pulled in as the first president. But now, as did Cincinnatus, he's going to be putting down his sword and taking back the plow and going back to Mount Vernon to farm and to return to civilian life, and to set that important precedent that a president should only hold power for 2 terms and then move on. But what I would suggest when we're looking at now the imagery, the symbolism within this portrait, is that maybe in addition to Zeus and Moses and Cincinnatus, maybe in addition to those figures, we might see Washington as also a Noah, a figure tied to Noah as well. We don't have to go too far to start seeing allusions to the story of Noah. In the background, to the bottom left in the sky, you see clouds, storm clouds, that are now beginning to dissipate. To the top right, and it extends to just over his right shoulder in the bottom left. If you look closely, there's a beautiful rainbow, a symbol of hope that the storms have passed. All allusions, of course, to the rainbow in the story of Noah, the flood, the deluge, all of that is suggested in the sky behind Washington. This was even pointed out in an advertisement for this painting when it was going on display in the United States. And I highlighted the one portion from this that I draw your attention to. The article states that he, referring to Washington, is surrounded with allegorical emblems of his public life in the service of his country, which are highly illustrative of the great and tremendous storms which have frequently prevailed. These storms have abated, and the appearance of the rainbow is introduced in the background as a sign of hope, a sign of troubled waters may be coming to pass. Washington has led us through those storms and advanced. Coincidentally, probably unbeknownst to Gilbert Stuart, I doubt he'd know this excerpt from a letter that Washington wrote to James Madison in 1786, 10 years earlier. But this thought about storms and clouds, is evident in these words when he wrote to Madison. Washington wrote to Madison, "No morn has ever dawned more favorably than ours did, and no day was ever more clouded than present." And he was alluding to something that was going on in 1786 that was definitely producing storm clouds over the nation that had him very concerned. And so again, this metaphorical reference to storm clouds, clouds in general, as being signs of political turbulence, something Washington even shared in a letter to Madison. And so when we look at the painting and we think rainbow and storm clouds, well, for the love of goodness, if you're going to have an allusion to Noah, then what do you have to have? And of course, you're sitting there thinking, and this is where I wish we were in person so people could start yelling, the ark, the ark. Okay, you got to have an ark if you're going to have a reference to Noah. And this is then the detail that starts becoming the real thread that starts to unravel and opened this wonderful relationship up with the Lansdowne painting, because we find on the table a boat. It's an inkwell. It's in the shape of a boat. It has Washington's family emblem on it. It's rested on dogs, on the back of dogs. And when you look at that boat and you're now thinking of like Noah, you might start in your mind putting together an image of Noah's Ark. Would that be an allusion to it? Well, what have others said? So I started doing the research on that. What work had been done on the inkwell in the painting? And so there wasn't too much in the various reference or articles, books that I checked. In particular, I'll tell you, if you want to have a fun time, go to the Lansdowne Portrait online, Lansdowne Portrait National Treasure, and it's through the National Portrait Gallery. They have this wonderful interactive website with this portrait, and you can click on different areas of the portrait. And it'll tell you basically like biographical information. It'll tell you about symbolism within the painting and so forth. It's really an interesting resource. It gives you some nice information about the portrait. And on that site, it references the inkwell. And this is what it says. The inkwell and quill may refer to the making of laws and the fact that Washington wrote and signed many important documents in his lifetime. The two documents on the table could be Stuart's way of symbolizing Washington's role in important documents, but Stuart does not portray any specific document, such as the recently signed Jay's Treaty. So while there are documents, we don't know what they are, but I like that it was leaning toward the thought about this being tied to the writing of laws, to signing laws. Now we're starting to, think a little more about the rule of law and of course, how this might be tying the portrait to that concept. The site goes on and says that although Washington owned a great quantity of silver, which he took care to order with his full arms or the crest, the inkwell in the painting may not be a real object. Stuart generally did not use what we would call props. The inkwell fashioned in the neoclassical boat design inspired by Roman antiquity apparently came from his imagination, emphasis mine. A quill pen rests in a hole in the roof of the inkwell's cabin. So it is alluding to that, and that would make sense. You've got classical columns, it would make sense. Roman Republic, that's what the nation was founded on, not Athenian democracy. That was seen as dangerous. The founding fathers looked to the Roman Republic for a republican model for government. So to have a neoclassical Roman Republican ship would make sense. So that's perfectly fine. To include and to view it that way. Interestingly, in 2016, the National Portrait Gallery took this painting down and had it cleaned and conserved, and they did reflectography, infrared reflectography, and looked beneath the canvas, beneath the paint rather, and saw how the painting had been changed. And you can make out there, I think you can see pretty clearly, if my mouse is here, right there, there was a second quill in the cabin that actually had two quills originally, and then Stuart painted over it in the final version. And so put them side by side, and you can see that originally there had been a quill sticking out in this area as well, and he took that away for whatever reason. So that was kind of an interesting find when they did that. But going back to the ship itself, and what others have said, Margaret C.S. Christian, in her work, The Story of the Lansdowne, Washington, in George Washington, A National Treasure, writes that the silver inkstand in the neoclassical boat shape and faintly displaying the Washington family coat of arms may or may not be a real object. The crouching hounds bring to mind Plutarch's, a much-read author among 18th century Americans, Plutarch's observation that dogs symbolize the conservative, watchful, philosophical principle of life, a sentiment certainly espoused by the Federalists. Goes on, and here we see imagery that can support the idea that the painting, that this boat is modeled after a Roman ship. And you can see some examples, and you can see, I think, that the shape of the boat, and I'm probably butchering it, my Latin's not great, but corbita, that this particular type of boat, which corbita translates to basket because it's shaped like a basket, that it does resemble that. There is a neoclassical slant, Roman slant to this design, but the cabin is still there. What about the cabin? The cabin's not represented on the Roman boats. And so again, is there imagery that might tie this more to the ark as opposed to simply a neoclassical Roman boat? And lo and behold, there is. Now, these are just a couple of examples, but notice that this 12th century Italian depiction of Noah's Ark has a similar design with the cabin, the basket shape of the boat with a cabin put on it as described in relation to Noah's Ark. And then this one was pretty telling. This painting from 1570 of Noah's Ark, and again, looking at it and then comparing these images to our inkwell, there is a visual allusion to, one could argue, Noah's Ark, which would make sense with storm clouds, a rainbow, and so forth, all evident. And so with that, you now start to see not only the storm, the rainbow, possibly Noah's Ark, three allusions all surrounding Washington, tying him to this Noah's Ark, the flood, and all of those themes that go with that. And compositionally, you see a nice corridor running from the rainbow, covering the clouds, following his extended arm, which then rests just above the ark, the inkwell that may be an ark. Now, the next slide here, I apologize, this one's going to have a little bit of writing to it, but we need to sort of understand his perspective on government, Washington's perspective on government, on the rule of law, to see if there could be any kind of connection between that thought and then this metaphorical reflection on Noah's Ark and storms that you know, overcome a country or a state, and then the hope, the rainbow, and all of that. And so with that allusion we talked about a little bit ago, in 1786, when there were so many storms that he wrote to Madison, what he was referring to was Shays's rebellion. Now, keep in mind, in 1786, the Constitution had not been created yet. The United States was an independent nation, but it was working under the Articles of Confederation, its first government, the Articles of Confederation, which gave a lot of power to the states. The independent states were loosely united under the Articles of Confederation. There was no presidency. There was a president of the Congress, but there was only a legislative branch. It was lacking a judicial branch. It was lacking an executive branch. The federal government under the Articles had no way to tax directly the people. And they also couldn't call forth an army unless the states put forth the volunteers to go fight collectively against any kind of enemy, foreign or domestic. And in 1786, the Western Massachusetts farmers were overwhelmed with debt, and they were having issues. And so they rose up under the leadership of Daniel Shays, and it was Shays's rebellion. They marched on courthouses. They shut down the courthouses so that foreclosures could not happen. And the federal government under the Articles was basically unable to do anything to put down this insurrection, this uprising. And Washington was very concerned about that. So in that frame, he writes, and I'm kind of weaving some of my words in with Washington's to make his quotes make sense. But this was another letter to James Madison, or actually the same one from 1786. And what it indicates is that through this letter, Washington is indicating that to him, the debtor's actions suggest that the nation as a whole was, in Washington's words, fast verging to anarchy and confusion. He went on to then relate to Madison that in order to address the matter, there needed to be a more energetic federal government. And he goes on to ask Madison if there exists not a power to check them, those that were rising up, what security has a man for life, liberty, or property? If there is not some sort of force in place to protect citizens, then what is going to protect their lives, their liberty, and their property? Only through to Washington, a more energetic government, a government that has the power to uphold the rule of law and place a check on the perceived licentiousness that was unfolding in Massachusetts, could that Lockean natural rights of life, liberty, and property be protected. So to Washington, if everything remained the same under the Articles of Confederation, with, in his words, 13 sovereignties pulling against each other and all tugging at the federal head, only ruin would be brought to the whole. Only in Washington's words, a liberal and energetic constitution, well guarded and closely watched to prevent encroachment, might restore us to that degree of respectability and consequence to which we had a fair claim and the brightest prospect of attaining. To Washington, an energized federal government with some power to keep licentiousness at bay and in check, that would be the key to preserving life, liberty, and property. And as he then states in his farewell address, 10 years later, similar sentiments as he goes on to say, your union ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of the one ought to endear to you the preservation of the other. The union, through the strength of the union, our liberty can be preserved, and we must love one as the other. And then going on in that same address or essay, he indicates that respect for the federal government's authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures, are duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. The basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the constitution which at any time exists, till changed by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory upon all. It is not simply to be respected. The Constitution is not simply to be respected. It is to be venerated. It is to be sacredly obligatory upon all. So the rule of law established through the Constitution must be upheld by the masses in order for all of us to protect our lives, liberty, and property. He goes on and says, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, referring to religion and morality, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. I like that sentence. I don't know if you're catching it there, and maybe I'm reading too much, but I think it's very comical how he puts, you've got the mere politician, and then you have the pious man. They're not the same, but they need to be equal in that sense. The politician needs to be pious if they can. So maybe a little bit of a Roy Rogers kind of jab at politicians or something there. I don't know. But then finally, this is the last long quote, I promise. He says, and this is something worth reflecting on, especially in regard to the rule of law. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. He's bringing forth a recognition that if an oath is not carrying some sort of moral weight on the conscience of the individual, then the oath will have no weight, and people will swear out accusations willy-nilly, and any and all of us could be under threat, under duress because of that. And so he's indicating that again, this respect for the rule of law, it goes beyond simple respect. It is a moral obligation we have to be virtuous citizens, to be honest, to be upright, and to respect and obey the rule of law, even when the law is wrong, to then fight it within legal channels within the law. And so, again, with that kind of verbiage, and those are only a few samples of some of the quotes from Washington that I think would support his view of the importance of an energized federal government and the need for a virtuous citizenry in this republic to respect the rule of law, could start to suggest that there's a vision here that what our arc is as a nation is the rule of law. That is what will get us through storms. That is what will get us to the rainbow. It is the Constitution as being an arc. It is the rule of law as being an arc that will allow for the republic to survive. Now, this is where it got interesting, because I have this all, and I might have mentioned this before we actually started recording. I have all this typed up. I'd like to see about getting it published. It's about a 30-page essay on this. And I have been a big fan of ChatGPT, having a lot of fun with it. And so, yes, I got the $20 a month subscription just because it's so cool. So with doing that, you can upload documents and have ChatGPT give you feedback. So I did. I uploaded my essay and I said, critique it. And it said, it came back summarizing my argument perfectly. It was scary. And it did it in just like less than a minute. 30 seconds. And it then started challenging me. Well, you're, and in a very polite way, I might add, which is nice. But it was saying basically, that's nice, but you're reading a lot into the inkwell. Is there any evidence that there was any contemporary thought of an arc being similar, tied to the rule of law? And I knew that was an issue. I really did. I was thinking, darn it, if this thing's going to call me on it, then a human definitely will. So I started doing a lot more research online and through a database of newspapers and so forth. And I was looking for Noah's Ark references in newspapers from approximately 1790 to 1810, the period that would be contemporary to this. And lo and behold, it only took a few minutes, and I found, just one article right off the bat that did this. July 23rd, 1804, Jenks Portland Gazette, Portland, Maine. In this article, the editorialist writes, there is an ark of safety for our country. Sin was the cause of the flood in Noah's time. Liberty without bounds and licentiousness without restraint are the fountains whence floods of inequity proceed. which have a powerful influence to destroy national dignity and glory. Goes on, when public good is sacrificed for self-interest, the floodgate of wretchedness is opened, national character injured, republicanism on the decline, and monarchy and despotism in a state of embryo. The Ark of Safety, referring to the federal Constitution, which I just thought was, wow, that was pretty cool. It blatantly states, it ties the Ark of Safety, basically is the federal Constitution. Let it be the highest ambition of Americans not to alter, but to keep in good repair their excellently political art, that she may carry her passengers to the Ararat of peace and safety. Let us be careful to choose wise, disinterested, good men to pilot our ark. Then all her passengers will be in safety and feel happy and independent. So there is a contemporary reference of the ark being metaphorically a reflection of the Constitution, the rule of law in essence, and then also us needing good pilots, good stewards to guide that ship forward to protect us and liberty. As far as on that, and by the way, I took those excerpts and loaded it into ChatGPT and I said, okay, I found this 1804. Now do you buy my argument? It agreed with me. So I thought that was pretty cool. That boosted my ego a little there, you know, I mean, the AI, I mean, come on. So anyway, all right. So on the table, there are also books referencing Journal of Congress, the Federalist Papers. On the bottom, there's the General Orders, American Revolution, Constitution and Laws of the United States. There's a juxtaposition there on the table itself, military and the rule of law. So the rule of law is still upheld in the writings around the inkwell, but so too now is a military side. And this is where it started getting a little more interesting because, again, and I just put this in just as a reminder, don't forget, Washington put a dove that he designed above Mount Vernon, which also ties him to Noah. And the dove carrying the olive branch. And here's a painting of Mount Vernon with the dove. Actually, you can make it out there as of 1790, circa 1790. But anyway, but with the dove and the olive branch and peace, we think of the rule of law as being peace. And you can think of even going to Machiavelli and the Prince, chapter 12, where he talks about all states are founded on good laws and good arms. There's a historical reflection on the need for strong arms, but that's not enough. You need strong laws, but you need strong arms as well to enforce the law. And so in that spirit, when we look at the fact that we've got that Bingham portrait that's very similar, I think it's interesting. There are two things that Bingham doesn't have in his painting. First, he doesn't have an ark. He has an inkwell. It has two quills. It's not an ark. It's an inkwell. Bingham is not a Noah for the nation, as Washington is. But also, notice how his chair is similar but different, because if you look closely at Washington's, and I'll highlight this in a second, it has the emblem from the national seal on it, the American flag on it. Bingham's does not. Also, Bingham does not have the leg of his table exposed like Washington does. And I think that's important because Stuart is doing one other thing here, very interesting in regard to composition and possible symbolism. We have the eagle exposed on the table, carved into it. That's an eagle and then another eagle on the side. And interestingly, the eagles are holding arrows. They're not holding olive branches. They're just holding the arrows. And then we have another allusion to the Great Seal in the chair, and there it's a lot clearer. So with that, with the eagles, the sword, the arrows, and then the back of that chair, we do have an allusion to the Great Seal. And of course, with the Great Seal, the eagle carries in its right talon the olive branch for peace, in its left talon, arrows symbolizing war, and then, of course, the emblem that's on the chair right there in the chest of the eagle, and the eagle looks toward peace, symbolizing that America wants peace, but is ready to defend itself through war if needed. It's rumored, and I think this is accurate, the one time that the seal had the eagle turn its head to arrows was FDR during World War II, and he had the Great Seal carpet in the Oval Office. redesigned so that while World War II was going on, the eagle turned toward the arrows. But with that being said, look what we have in Washington. We have one outstretched arm that he's looking down his arm, the right arm, which is over the quill of the inkwell that is the ark and the rule of law. But yet resting at his side is his hand on a sword. He almost compositionally takes on the look of the eagle on the Great Seal. As the eagle looks to the olive branch, so Washington looks at the rule of law. As the eagle holds arrows ready for war, so Washington has his hand rested on a sword, which is kind of an interesting, I think, perspective on this in regard to how Stuart may be conveying that message that the rule of law matters. It is the ark that will get us through the storms that we face, the political storms that we face. But yet those laws have to be enforced. And Washington did so in his presidency when in 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion erupted on the Pennsylvania frontier because of the excise tax. You can tax my carriage, but you can't tax my whiskey is one of the thoughts behind that. Don't tax my whiskey. Now, whiskey was very important to those farmers, and they rose up in rebellion when the tax was going to be levied against their whiskey. And like with Shays's rebellion, where the government could do nothing, unlike Shays's rebellion, in this case, the federal government mobilized quickly, marched to the Pennsylvania frontier and put down that rebellion. And Washington donned his uniform and went out and inspected the troops. Washington took up arms to defend the law and enforce the law, because laws alone have to also have enforcement. And so taken together, there's again, a relationship that was allowed to be developed between myself and this portrait. And I so appreciate you all allowing me to share that relationship with you all tonight. I hope you will go and look at works of art, whether again, poetry, literature, fine arts, and develop your own relationships. And many times all it takes is one small item in the painting to pull you into a wonderful narrative and a very rewarding experience, and possible deeper understanding of not only yourself, but just maybe some of the ideals that surround, in this case, this great nation that we are all fortunate to live within. So thank you all so much. And I'll of course turn it over now if we have time for any questions. I think I hit almost an hour. I was joking about the 3 hours earlier, and I know some of you were getting scared. But are there
Goodness.
questions?